English film. But yeah, my understanding is that when Xi Jinping became the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, he had every member of the party watch a documentary about U.S. military interventions and U.S. imperialism, and also watch a documentary about the fall of the USSR and how not a single shot was fired. And that was widely reported on in the American media at the time. U.S. media was very terrified of Xi Jinping. One thing, it's not that important, but I was in the Workers' World Party at the time. And in the Workers' World Party, we were pro-China. We maintained China was a workers' state, but that China had lost its way. It was like China was revisionist, basically. We thought the Gang of Four and Mao were good. Deng Xiaoping was kind of bad, and China still socialist, but that was kind of our position. And then in like the final years that I was in the Workers' World Party, a leader of the Chinese Communist Party in Chongqing, named Bo Xilai, was arrested for corruption. And Bo Xilai had really played up the communist culture. It put a lot of communist propaganda on television and stuff like that. And so Workers' World Party went into overdrive about how Bo Xilai was being persecuted. They supported Bo Xilai. And Fred Goldstein wrote all these articles about the fall of Bo Xilai, and it was all this. And we had these internal meetings in the party to discuss the China question. And Fred would get up there and talk, right? And then other people would raise their hands and just repeat what Fred was saying. And I remember at one of these meetings, I raised my hand and I said, when I'm out selling the paper, I was like the only one who did any outreach. When I'm out selling the paper, people often ask me about China, and this is what I say. And then he starts shouting at me, "Who gave you permission to say that?" I'm thinking, well, I have to say something when these people are there. I think we should develop talking points together as a group. I'm thinking, well, I'm out there on the street, and people are asking me about China, and I'm answering their question. Fred, you're not there, and you're mad at me for saying this. Okay, sorry. But the meeting that we're at where we talked about this hadn't happened yet. I'm saying what Fred is so angry with me for, having things that I say to people when they ask me about China, because it would frequently come up when I was selling the paper at Occupy Wall Street and on the streets of New York City. People frequently said, yeah, well, what about China? And I had things that I said. Fred was super mad at me for saying things without, asking the great leader. But anyway, so Fred, we have these internal meetings that are not really meetings. It's just Fred, farting out whatever his opinion is, and then everyone going, oh, yeah, that's what we should do. And so then after that, Fred writes a whole series of articles about, is China taking the capitalist road, about how the fall of Bo Xilai, oh my God, this is the turning point. China's going to be overthrown. This is the fall of the Soviet Union. He's predicting that China is going to collapse like the USSR and all this. And then what happened next? Bo Xilai was arrested, imprisoned, and then Xi Jinping became the leader of the Chinese Communist Party and started cracking down on corruption and emphasizing communism. And it was the exact opposite of what Fred said. Fred could not have been more wrong. Fred fell in love with Bo Xilai, and it was all about, they arrested Bo Xilai. It's over. Communism's over in China. They're taking the capitalist road. It's Gorbachev and the USSR. And he could not have been more wrong. I'm like the only person who realized this, and as I was leaving, I'm like, guys, you do know Fred, who wouldn't really allow any debate about Bo Xilai, who was mad at me just for having things that I said to people on the street when they bought the newspaper from me about China. He just wrote this whole series of articles that was exactly wrong. It was exactly wrong. And I mean, he could not have been more wrong. And, Fred, I learned a lot from Fred, and Fred has died, and I've forgiven Fred on some level. Fred and I did not get along, and that, examples of this, he got tripped up by his own ego, but the problem was that Fred wanted control, but he didn't do the work. Okay. I was at the office every day. I was out in the street selling the newspaper every day. I lived in a basement with 6 other people. people. I was barely surviving. I was like, living off of, I mean, I lived in a lot of poverty. I lived in a basement in Queens with 6 other people. I was barely getting by. I was selling newspapers to make enough money, and I was out in the street every day promoting the party. Fred would come to the party office once a month if he was giving a speech, but yet he wanted control. Well, if you're not there, you can't have control. And that was the issue, is that I was at the office every day, I was at the office every day, and then he was always complaining, and he would complain to other people, oh, these young people that are joining the party, they're listening to Caleb. That's because I'm there. That's because I'm the one at the office talking to them. Fred, if you'd be at the office, they would listen to you, right? But he didn't understand. He wanted to be the great leader, but he didn't want to do the work, right? And it was an ego thing. It was totally an ego thing. He thought he was Sam Marcy. Sam Marcy was the founder of the Workers' World Party. Fred thought he was Sam Marcy. And that's what the Bo Xilai thing was. Sam Marcy, his final work had been writing about the fall of the USSR, writing big articles analyzing it. So Fred was projecting, I'm old and I'm getting ready to die, and I'm the leader of the group, so I'm writing about the fall of China. Well, the Soviet Union was falling in Sam Marcy's final years. China was not falling. And he thought he was the great leader at the top who could do all the thinking, but there was not an army underneath him. The group was collapsing and falling apart. And so it's like he wanted to think of the talking points on China that I would say, but he didn't want to sit down with me and engage with me. And like, whenever I would talk to Fred, like I would ask him one question, about Trotsky or something, and it would just be, he couldn't really handle being challenged intellectually. He was so used to being the great brain that if you said to him, yeah, but what about, he would just get angry and start shouting at you. He was he very much was used to being somebody who was not questioned, right? He was surrounded by people who thought he was so brilliant and so smart. And if you said to him, yeah, but what about, he would get angry. He took it as an offense, right? And if you thought of something that he didn't say, or I don't know. Sometimes you're never, I really try not to shoulda, coulda, woulda, right? I really try not to. I always think, like, was there a way that I acted, I could have gotten Fred to be friendlier? Because when I first moved to New York, I really looked up to Fred in so many ways. I really did, because he was ideological, and I learned so much about capitalism. I mean, about the problem of overproduction, the tendency of the falling rate of profit. And he was more political than most of the Workers' World Party leadership. Most of the people in Workers' World Party's leadership, they are not political. I'll just tell you that. Certain people who shall not be named, who were in charge of things, they didn't know Lenin from a pipe organ, right? They didn't ever read Marx. They don't know anything. They just know the movement, man. Be activists. They're great activists, and they're whatever. And whatever. But anyway, Fred was not like that. Fred was ideological, and that's why I liked Fred. And I had hoped when I moved to New York that I could learn from Fred. And a couple times I went over to his apartment. You couldn't learn from Fred. He would just start shouting at you, right? Part of learning is asking tough questions. Part of learning is, saying, well, I've heard blank, how is that different? And Fred would just start shouting. But what it really was, it wasn't Fred's fault. It's that his ideology is wrong. I mean, there's no other way around it. His ideology is wrong. The classic ML thing, especially, their weird Sam Marcy, one true Trotskyism theory, it doesn't fit anymore, right? And I realized that at the time I was getting out of the party, I realized that, you ask them about Venezuela. What is Venezuela? Right? What is Venezuela? I remember I had that conversation with Deirdre Griswold. And I said, well, okay, if a country can't be a socialist country unless it's like Cuba or North Korea, where it's a one-party state and all that, what is Venezuela? And she basically just started to tell me that Venezuela was Chile under Allende. And I'm like, no, it's not, because under Allende, the military was, what overthrew them. Pinochet came out of the military. In Venezuela, their military is trained in Cuba. In Venezuela, they have the Bolivarian militias. It's not Chile under Allende. And she's like, well, they need to change the state. Deirdre, the state is the bodies of armed men. They have changed the state. Well, no, they haven't, because they didn't have a violent civil war. I mean, I'm like, no, like they don't know what Venezuela is. Like they know they should support Venezuela because U.S. imperialism bad, but they can't explain what Venezuela is. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit their model. Their understanding of what Iran was. I mean, Iran was just a bourgeois nationalist state. Well, that's funny because it has 5-year economic plans. Iran is way more of a planned economy than China is. You do realize in China, it's only like 50% state ownership. In Iran, it's like 70% state ownership. In Iran, they have very active Basij councils that enforce the will of the supreme leader. The biggest economic entity is this revolutionary organization, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. But Iran is capitalist and China is socialist. That doesn't make sense. Right? Their ideology is very stuck. It's stuck in the late Cold War. It made sense in the 70s and 80s. But when it came to Venezuela, when it came to Iran, when it came to the Belt and Road Initiative, when it came to China, they didn't know what they were doing. And that's why Fred called it completely wrong with Bo Xilai and with China. He thought that Bo Xilai, the leader of Chongqing, who was convicted of corruption, he thought Bo Xilai was the great, the great Trotsky or the great, I don't know what of China. And that the fall of Bo Xilai was the counter revolution and all of that. And he couldn't have been more wrong. Xi Jinping's rise was the complete negation, the complete opposite of what Fred said would happen. He got it completely wrong. But if you had Fred's worldview, you would think that it was, it makes sense that Fred thought that. It's just that their view was wrong, right? And I guess if you've been in a party for 70 years, it would be very, very hard to say, my party is just wrong. Well, I'm not you. I'm not Fred. And I can say that classical ML is wrong. And, people don't get angry at me saying, I'm telling you, classic ML is not completely correct. It points to a lot of truth, but it's not completely correct. And if you just have the strict ML worldview, you're not going to be able to explain things like Venezuela. You're not going to be able to explain things like, like Iran, like the Belt and Road, like you're going to be lost, right? The classic Marxist-Leninist ML, that's what I mean by ML is Marxist-Leninist. The classic ML way of explaining things points to a huge amount of truth about imperialism, about the economic system of capitalism, about socialism. But there's things in it that don't work, that just don't work. The world doesn't fit. Iran doesn't fit, right? Venezuela doesn't fit. There are certain things that don't fit. You gots to innovationism. Damn right. You gots to innovationism. And that's why we're pioneering something new. And could we make mistakes? Sure. We're not saying we're infallible. We're not saying we have a magic solution, but we have a new understanding based on how the world is now, based on the knowledge that we have, called innovationism. And we published this book, What is Innovationism? And, it's free on the website. You can go to cpiusa.org. You can read this book for free. Just click on the PDF. We're not trying to make money off the book. But the classic ML way of doing things is limited. And, and that's why Fred was getting angry, is because he didn't have the answer. So, his ideology had a lot of holes in it. There's no way around that. So yeah, and look, the people, for a while, I was the biggest advocate of wave red flags, wave hammers and sickles and all of that. And that was right at one time, because in the aftermath of the financial crisis, there was a lot of room to criticize capitalism. There were a lot of anti-capitalist arguments Americans had never heard. So to be out there in your face in the name of communism was very strategic, and very few people were doing it. Now a lot of people are doing that, right? Now, the woke left, there's the Revolutionary Communists of America. They're marching out there. A lot of people are doing that now. And it's not helpful, honestly, because a lot of the right wing think that woke people are communists. Most communists just repeat woke talking points and are anti-growth. And honestly, walking around and doing the red flag thing and the hammer sickle thing now doesn't help. It kind of hurts, to be honest. And we did that a little bit when CPI started, and we're moving away from that because conditions have changed. There was a time where if you did that, Nobody was doing that. No one was waving red flags and hammers and sickles. No one was doing that. So if you did that, it created an opening through which you could have a conversation about the Soviet Union, about anti-imperialism. That's not the case anymore, right? Now in the United States, if people see that, they go, oh, I know what you are. And it doesn't help. And it scares it reinforces the right wing's delusions about degrowth being communism, about globalism being communism, the World Economic Forum is communism. And honestly, if you're doing that now, it's not helping. And honestly, I think three-letter agencies are involved in making it happen. And I said that before the election. And I mean, there's a lot that's happened since then that I'm not going to comment on in these streams. But honestly, if you're running around doing the hammer, sickle, red flag thing, it hurts. It hurts things because no one listens to you. And that is my biggest thing I will say to you, right? Again, and I actually said this I wrote an article during the elections. We've kind of redone our website since then, but I'll say it again. Watch out for people who aren't teaching anything, right? Again, if somebody's not teaching anything, right? If nobody learns anything, something's off. And that's what I saw during the, September, September, August of last year. All of a sudden, revolutionary communists of America are marching through the streets, red flags. We're communists. Communism is awesome. They're not teaching anybody anything. No one's learning anything from them. They're just scare porn for conservatives. Just look at us. We're communists. I'm like, this is not good. And I think the deep state is helping this happen, honestly. And I would be very careful. I was worried that something like January 6th might happen, that these people might be led to, do some criminal act or something that then led to, going to war with China or something. I was very concerned about it. And there were other things that happened that also still raised some concerns because nobody is learning anything. Again, part of it is just that writer disease where people just want to show how smart they are. They don't care if anyone learns anything. And I think there's a lot of that in some other places. So that may not be some kind of government operation. That may just be people with unhinged egos. And there's plenty of that. But still, if someone's not teaching you something, right? If they're just out there beating their chest about, I am a communist, look at me, they're just out there making a spectacle, but they're not teaching you anything. That's a serious point of concern. And that is something I see a lot of people creating a spectacle that doesn't educate. It's okay to create a spectacle. Creating a spectacle is absolutely necessary, but your spectacle should educate. People should learn from your spectacle. When we marched around with Trump and Kim, we were making a spectacle. That spectacle that said only peace can make America great again, that had Trump and Kim shaking hands, we made an impact. That was a spectacle, a big spectacle. That's a huge banner, but it changed the conversation, right? It was a way to boost the anti-war message within the Trump camp. It was a way to support people's Korea against the sanctions. It was a way to say, this is who we want Trump to be. It was a really good thing that we did during the election. We created a spectacle, but it taught people something. And if we had just run around, look at us, we're communists, red flags, are you scared, conservatives? What good would that have done? Well, it would have done something good for anti-China folks who want war with China. It would have done something good for the conservative commentators that are trying to warn everybody, oh, the woke left are communists. And they could point to that. See, look, they're communists. They're waving red flag. You're not really contributing anything. And if you just kind of put on a spectacle of communism, at one point, yes, that could do something good. At this point, it doesn't. Whereas we made a spectacle of Trump and Kim, and that did something good, right? And it's not that we're afraid to say what we believe in, right? We've got whole kinds of books. What is innovationism and all of that? But we're trying to push forward a message in a way that will advance the struggle against imperialism. And we did a great job in our Kamala Harris book that we distributed during the election. Shout out to everybody who went to Chicago and all that. You did a great job. And I mean, we have been trying with our limited resources to make a big impact, to push back against globalism, imperialism, and build the network of people, right? That's what this whole broadcast has been about. We just hit the four hour mark. We're 5 minutes into the fourth hour here. But we're against globalism, imperialism. We want a government of action that fights for working families. And everything we do is about strategically trying to awaken that level of consciousness, to get people to understand that our enemy is not in Yemen, our enemy is not in Russia or China or Iran or Venezuela or Cuba. Our enemy is Wall Street and London, the globalist imperialist system. That is our enemy. And what we need is a government of action that will break the big monopolies and empower and invest in working families and communities. That's what we need. And that's what our big convention coming up in Chicago is going to be all about. So I hope that you all will be there. It's going to be absolutely awesome, our Chicago convention. You don't want to miss it. Register at the link down below. And the Chicago people, if you're in the Chicago area, please reach out to us. We need all the help we can get. Gabby can't put all those door knockers on doors by herself. John and Ellie, and there's a lot of great folks in Chicago who are doing great work, but they need support. They need support. And building this convention, filling up that auditorium is not going to be easy. And there's a lot that needs to be done because we have to build this movement. We've got to build the ship. We got to build the ship before the flood comes. We got to build the network. We got to build a group of people who can work together because we need a government of action to fight for working families. Imperialism is heading for a crisis, but we can rely on each other. We can build the network. So get involved. Get involved. I'm not here to pander to you. I'm not here to put on a show. I'm here to get you involved. I'm here to recruit you to join the Center for Political Innovation, become a dues-paying member, get involved in our activities, help build the Chicago Convention, come to the Chicago Convention, fill up that auditorium. We need you there. Dare to struggle, dare to win, folks. Dare to struggle, dare to win.